So yeah, what we did in the report is number one to point out to people to make sure they realize this that Europe was in an energy crisis, and people were using that phrase before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So obviously that exacerbated things, but this situation was in place well before that. Just to give you some idea, in July of 2021, right? So last summer, natural gas prices in Europe were up 670% just year over year. All right, just to show you just the skyrocketing price. Electricity prices in 2021 in Germany, the UK, and France were up more than 200% in each of those countries, right? So like a tripling. And so again, that those timelines were showing this was before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so then in the study we say, okay, what are the factors going on? Why was Europe in such dire straits? And we listed some factors, all of which are also true right now in terms of Canada and its government's policies. And so that's what the point of the report is to warn. And so it has to do with being hostile to conventional fossil fuels. And so companies aren't investing as much. And then having in Europe, they have what's called an emissions trading system, which is like a price put on carbon. And they jacked up significantly recently. And that's very similar to Canada's tax on carbon. And so our concern was if Canada is following the same policies that they had in Europe in place, is an energy crisis going to come to Canada as well?
Yeah, well, it seems like we're trying to legislate an alternative to hydrocarbons, but we haven't developed the alternative yet. So, I mean, it's inevitable that's going to lead to some spikes in pricing if we don't somehow ramp up wind and solar generation very quickly and effectively, which isn't going to happen.
Right. So what seems to be happening, and this pattern's all over the place, but you see it in Europe in particular, is that certain jurisdictions, for example, Ireland, Germany, and France, they outright banned fracking, and they have policies in place to discourage coal-fired power plants, in particular, electricity derived from coal. And so you're right. In the short term, we can't just instantly switch over to having solar and wind fill the gap. Those are intermittent sources. When the sun's not shining, when the wind's not blowing, you need something else. And so that meant the brunt of it fell on natural gas. And then for various reasons, because natural gas prices went up so much, that's why it fed into electricity prices. So that's sort of the quandary that the world finds itself in as governments push away from coal-fired plants. Right now, natural gas has to pick up the slack because it's not as carbon intensive and it's more reliable than wind or solar. And so then when you have a disruption, like, for example, interruptions in natural gas exports from Russia, then, of course, the economies are more dependent on that.
Yeah, and we are seeing, I mean, similar actions in Canada. Quebec is an outstanding example. I mean, they've got some pretty good natural gas reserves there, it appears. They started with a fracking ban, and now they've actually just basically said, no, we're not going to do any oil and gas development whatsoever in our province, and they're leaving that in the ground. But that's not, I mean, that can only contribute to higher prices then.
Right. And in terms, too, of federal policy, too, in Canada. So, for example, they've got, most obviously the carbon tax that's in place that's set to get up to $170 a ton by the year 2030. They've got an outright a cap they've placed on greenhouse gas emissions from the oil and gas sector. So with all this stuff, it sounds good in principle. And I understand, the desire that, we're concerned about climate change. We want to limit those emissions. But we have to, policymakers and Canadian citizens, of course, need to understand what the flip side is. These things come with a cost. And there's a reason right now that the infrastructure was so heavily reliant on natural gas and coal and oil. And that's because they're very dense forms of energy that are very convenient. Dispatchable is a term that's used. And again, just to switch over to these other forms, it comes at a cost. And as you say, like a carbon tax, this isn't some undesirable side effect. The avowed purpose of that is to make electricity and transportation derived from carbon intense products more expensive. That's the whole point of taxing something, is to make it more expensive to discourage people from using it. And so, yeah, we shouldn't be shocked. Gee, how come energy is so expensive all of a sudden when the government's policies are explicitly designed to make them more expensive?
Yeah, but they didn't discourage us from using anything. They just made it a heck of a lot more expensive for all of us. So, I mean, it's only having half, I think, the intended purpose, I imagine, because there's not an alternative realistically to go to.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And so, in fairness, some of the people who were designing these policies and the projections they may have been relying on had optimistic assumptions built into it to say, if we keep making strides in battery power, or if there's widespread adoption of electric vehicles, or various things like that, if solar panels become more efficient, then, oh, we could afford to move away from the current reliance on more conventional forms of energy, and it wouldn't be so expensive. But yeah, the problem is in actually implementing that in terms of the timetables. It's not ready for prime time yet. And so, yes, as you say, by making this stuff more expensive, people still need to heat their homes. They still need to drive to work. And so they have no choice in the short term but to suck it up and pay higher prices.
Yeah, well, and likewise, I mean, I know it only has limited effect, but still, I mean, if we supplied more in the world market, that's going to have a degree of offsetting on world prices. But our biggest, well, one of the biggest world consumers and our biggest export customer is the United States. But President Biden, while he's acknowledging an energy crisis, seems to, we see no indication he wants any more Canadian product. He's actually going cap in hand to Saudi Arabia and Venezuela asking for more. Like, is there ways we could develop our relationship better with the United States to help exacerbate some of this? Or?
Well, yeah, I mean, with all this stuff, I mean, when the Biden administration came in, of course, they were very hostile to pipeline development, and there were a lot of so-called green groups that the Biden administration wanted to, placate in terms of taking action, some of which was just symbolic. So yeah, you're right, and I guess part of that is that because they made those moves early on, they don't want to be seen as backtracking. But you're right, especially it is ironic that the United States policy, instead of building more alliances with its northern neighbor, is reaching out to areas of the world that are traditionally unreliable. And the U.S. as well also has a lot of domestic resources that it's not tapping, again, because government policy either literally forbids it or makes the people in the industry realize it would be foolish enough to invest billions of dollars developing this, because for all we know, 10 years from now, the regulatory climate's going to be different. So with all this stuff too, there's a chilling effect on the private sector's development, even if the explicit government policy right now doesn't forbid some of these things.
Yeah, that's what I kind of wanted to get to, because even if we wanted to ramp up Canadian production, that's going to take a lot of capital, a lot of investment. Timelines are long. And to be honest, in looking at how many projects have been canceled or delayed or regulated to death, we don't look like a safe place to invest in those kinds of projects, because we don't know if you could ever get it to completion.
Right. Yeah. And we have some figures there in the study that you may have seen, that in terms of like the European energy mix, in terms of R&D, there was a lot more over the last 10 years that's been pumped into, so-called renewable sources, things like battery power, things like that, not very much into more conventional forms. And you can understand why. Again, from an individual investor's point of view, it's a rational decision to make, that you don't want to spend a bunch of money investing in a coal-fired power plant if, for all you know, 8 years from now, they're going to come out and say this is illegal, or they're going to put in place such a punitive carbon tax that it's no longer profitable to run. So you can see why they would get out of that. And that's partly what you see is too, is like the contribution to the energy mix coming from coal is way down in various jurisdictions. And again, it's because they read the writing on the wall and they know it would be foolish for us to invest in this.
Yeah, so getting another aspect of things too, we saw that from Minister O'Regan the other day, was labor, a shortage of skilled labor. Like if we do want to ramp it up, we're also down on a lot of energy-related labor. I mean, they've been told for years, get out of this, it's going to transition, don't join this labor force. And now that even if we want to ramp it up, we don't have the skilled people really to push in there fast.
Right. Yeah. So a lot of this, I think, is you can interpret it as sort of like the chickens coming home to roost, that things that have been in place for years are now finally rearing their ugly head. That it's, as you say, so yes, up till now, we've been focusing on this conversation on like the physical capital, that, hey, if you haven't been building the pipelines, if you haven't been developing the oil wells and things like that, then it's hard just to turn on a dime and say, because the supplies from Europe are low, now we need to ramp up. Or in the Canadian context, now because the European exports are in trouble, like, Canada can fill the gap. It's hard just to turn that on a dime. But you're right, there's the human element as well, that if you were somebody, a 20-year-old going into engineering of some form, that, yeah, you would have also thought, the wave of the future, I want to get into the renewable sector because that seems to be promising and that's where the future lies. You wouldn't necessarily be going into these old, what you think are now obsolete technology. And so, yeah, at this point, if we need more of that, there's a shortage.
Yeah, so I mean, we know that the problem is kind of acute, and we seem to be on a similar trajectory to Europe right now, and we got another winter approaching in a few months. Like, what are the solutions, though? What can we do conceivably to ease this if we could coax the government to want to address it?
So, I mean, I think the obvious thing would be to rethink the policies that Canada, that the federal and provincial levels, depending on which province we're talking about, has that are quite analogous to what they had in Europe. So clearly, and we've written at the Fraser Institute on this more, like the federal carbon tax. For one thing, even if you stipulated, the conventional theory about externalities and how you need to have a tax in place to get firms and consumers to take into account their greenhouse gas emissions and the effect it has. Even so, the Canadian version of that is much higher in terms of where it's projected to go by 2030 than what the conventional estimates are of the impact of a marginal ton of emissions. So that's clearly not calibrated at the right level. So at the very least, you'd want to rethink that policy. And then just more generally, the hostility to conventional oil and gas development, again, that has a chilling effect on investment. And so I think policymakers should clarify and say, look, if we recognize this as an important part of the energy mix, then we're not going to take actions down the road to penalize this. And so, investors can be assured that if they go ahead and build something, that they'll be able to recoup their investment.
Yeah, well, and that hostility, a lot of it has more, ideological underpinnings than legislative, I guess you could say, or policy. I guess, I'm asking you to get a bit speculative. Do you think there's much chance of this government wanting to bend on a bit of that?
I mean, again, I can engage in the cold hard analysis here. You're right, it's but right. I am doubtful. It's partly too because certain political officials, if they made a career out of certain types of reg, it would be hard for them to turn on a dime. But there always is. Sometimes there is a case where when something really is a crisis situation, that they are willing to rethink and to realize, okay, maybe our plans before are a bit too aggressive, and what we're trying to do right now is too painful to our constituents. So yeah, there is room for that, and I think both sides should be forgiving. You know what I mean? Like if some side is willing to sort of make concessions and realize, okay, maybe what we've been trying to do is too aggressive and it's having unintended consequences, then the other side should welcome that and not say, oh, but this is all your fault. That say, okay, well, thank you for seeing the light finally.
Yeah, well, there are some pragmatic people in government, even if it doesn't feel like it at times. And I'm sure they're hearing from their constituents, they're having trouble paying the rent, they're having trouble getting to work or paying the utility bills, that something's got to ease. So maybe they'll be more receptive to reevaluating, I guess, the way the policy has been.
Yeah. And I would say too, just, I'm in the US and Canada, and I see the difference in the debates there. And in the US, it does tend to be more ideological, whereas in Canada, there's more of an emphasis on the actual data. That the Canadians seem, at least relative to the American political debate, it's more pragmatic. Like, is this working or not? And if it's not working, then we need to rethink this.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate that, and with what you'd put together, because it's saying, can Canada avoid it? I mean, you're saying there's room to avoid this crisis. We might be moving towards it, but if we pay attention, perhaps, and use the data and look ahead, we don't have to suffer quite the energy price shocks that they did.
So that's definitely, it's not a doomsaying document. It is more just of a warning. And yes, there is time for the Canadians to react to this situation and to try to avoid suffering the similar fate. And, at the end of the day, obviously, Canada's in a much better position sitting on all of those resources, as opposed to like Germany, which was so reliant on Russian exports of natural gas. And so now they're really in a tight spot.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have the resources, there's nothing you can do. It's you're going to be relying on somebody else providing. So we're fortunate that we have it. We just have to make sure we're properly utilizing it, I guess. So that's
exactly.
Where the discussion's important. Well, I appreciate you coming on to explain that, and you're putting out that report. Where can we find more information about what you've done and where the report is in full?
You just go to fraser.org.
And I guess just look for the well, I think it's right up top in the reports there and releases anyways of this one and among other things, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, in closing, anything else you'd like to add before I let you go, Mr. Murphy?
Well, again, I just would like to encourage Canadians to not take the media's treatment of these issues at face value, and that, again, it's not a matter of, oh, this is what the oil sector says or whatever. Even in terms of the conventional economic analysis, a lot of these policies don't make sense, and that they're being overly punitive on traditional forms of energy. And we're seeing this crisis play out in Europe, and hopefully we can avert it in time so it doesn't come to Canada.
Yeah, well, we can only keep encouraging a nuanced, rational discussion on it and hope for better outcomes. So I thank you for your contribution and for coming on to talk to us today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks. So yes, that was Robert Murphy with the Fraser Institute, and it is a good, even the executive summary alone kind of covers it. And if you want to dig more, there's a lot of excellent data in the full report, as he said, at FraserInstitute.org. You can get all that there. And